Hades 2 has excellent gameplay, killer aesthetics, and a story that struggles. And you don't have to take my word for it. Supergiant themselves realized that there was a problem and changed the ending of their game shortly after release. This updated ending is better, but is effectively a band-aid covering deeper narrative problems. So at the risk of fanning the flames and being flamed by fans, I'm going to dig into the problems that keep a beloved title from delivering on the story that we deserved. This is Ludologica. So a few notes before we begin. As with my last video, I will get fairly critical of Hades 2, but this does not mean that Hades 2 is a bad game. In general, I don't expect to spend too much of my time talking about bad games, and it is precisely because Hades 2 is such a good game that I think its weaknesses are worth talking about. If you loved the story of Hades 2, then think of this video as an exercise in imagining what could have been done differently. And honestly, I think we'll all get something out of it either way. But unlike my last video, which talked about structural concerns, this video will be chock full of spoilers. We are going to be discussing the ending of Hades 2 and Hades 1, the decanonized ending, the resolution of many NPC plot lines, and spoilers from the original myths of eons past. Everything is fair game. You have been warned. Finally, it became clear from some comments on my last video that many players are gameplay focused and think that losing sleep over the story of a roguelike is a waste of time. Well, let me tell you that if you think Hades 2 is a fun game and don't worry too much about the story, then that's valid. You don't have to care about this as much as I do, or to agree with me. However, keep in mind that there are many players for whom the story of Hades 2 is a huge part of the appeal, and there's something more specific I want to point out. Several articles and interviews have noted that the script of Hades 2 contains approximately 400,000 words, spread over 20 to 30,000 lines of dialogue. For comparison, that's nearly the word count of the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is about 480,000 words. Or for a closer comparison, ridiculously hefty novels like The Way of Kings or The Wise Man's Fear clock in at 383,000 and 395,000 words, respectively. These are books over 1,000 pages long, and they have a shorter word count than the script of Hades 2. Now, admittedly, this is a bit of an apples to oranges comparison, but Hades 2 in this comparison would be the oranges. Whichever one is harder to grow, I guess, because every line of dialogue also had to be voice acted, and then incorporated into a complex dialogue system. The sheer amount of time spent on fleshing out the story of this game, and then recording tens of thousands of lines of dialogue is mind-boggling. And the developers clearly spent this much time on it because they wanted their audience to care. So with all that in mind, I think it's more than fair for us to take this story seriously and see what it does and doesn't pull off. Part 1. Climbing to the Cliff's Edge. Let's start with the actual story of Hades 2. Kronos, Titan of Time, erstwhile ruler of all creation and progenitor of the Olympian gods, was cut into tiny pieces and sealed beneath Tartarus long ago. Now he's returned, has conquered the underworld, and his armies are vying for control of the surface as well. Melinoi is the youngest child of Hades and Persephone, and princess of the underworld. But she was an infant when Kronos emerged, and was secreted out of the house by Hecate, Witch of the Crossroads. Melinoi has spent her whole life in exile, training to someday confront and slay the Titan of Time. Pretty dramatic, but the situation is even more dire than that, for on the surface, Kronos has also unleashed Typhon, the father of all monsters, who is sieging Mount Olympus itself and threatens to end the rule of the gods. The solution? Naturally, it's for Melinoi to find a way to the surface, climb Mount Olympus, and defeat Typhon herself, on nights when she isn't beating Kronos to a pulp. So this is a pretty badass setup, but right from the start, we might notice a feature of Hades 2 that will make the story challenging to write: its epic scope. For a roguelite that gives only a few details at a time, there is a lot more ground to cover in terms of explaining character motivations and major story beats compared to its predecessor. And while the premise is still rooted in Greek mythology, the specific events of the game diverge pretty sharply from any traditional myth. That means that it's up to Supergiant to flesh out the dynamics of all the characters involved, and then write an original, satisfying conclusion. For comparison, the first Hades game had a simple premise: breaking out of the underworld, specifically so that Zagreus could find his mother and reunite his family. While the setup is still badass, being set in the underworld and battling mythic beings, at the end of the day, or night, the story has clear boundary lines around it, and a resolution that is already set up by traditional Greek mythology. At its heart, it's a personal story about Hades and his son learning to communicate, mostly by beating the snot out of each other. And even though Zagreus can't persist on the surface, he keeps fighting his way there just to spend one moment at a time with Persephone. His determination in the face of impossibility is what changes the hearts of those around him and drives the story forward. Meanwhile, Melinoi is tasked with confronting the two greatest existential threats in all of Greek mythology to the ongoing rule of the gods. And in order to even reach Typhon, she first has to alter the will of the fates and find a way to sever her tie to the underworld so that she can persist on the surface. This is a relatively minor complaint, but this does sort of trivialize the drama of the first game by having Melinoi fairly easily overcome the insurmountable barrier Zagreus had to accept as part of his journey. I also wish we saw more of the Olympians participating in the battle with Typhon beyond one lightning strike from Zeus. It seems like it would have been a rather obvious choice, given the premise, to have each of the gods take turns briefly appearing and delivering a punishing blow, to make it feel a little bit less like a single-handed victory by the youngest of the gods. And yet, victory in battle won't be enough for Melinoi, because Kronos and Typhon are both immortal divinities, and have a pesky habit of regenerating night after night. To achieve a more permanent victory, Melinoi uses her free moments in the House of Hades to reach through time and contact her brother Zagreus in the past, trying to enlist his help to stop Kronos before his return to power. She uses this link with her brother in another time, along with fragments of Typhon and Kronos, to craft a weapon that can unmake immortal beings, to permanently end the war and her task. So far, it's a pretty good story, even if its scope is large enough to get unwieldy at times. But there's also a lot of nuance going on under the surface. Melinoi wonders if killing time itself will have further consequences. Zagreus encourages her to wonder if killing a family member is truly necessary, which makes particular sense after his own journey of reconciliation with a father he struggled to understand. And then there's the major story themes Melinoi fails to notice, such as the cruelty of the gods, brought to our attention by the plethora of characters who were wronged by Olympians in their myths, such as Arachne, Prometheus, and Echo. In fact, Melinoi's single-minded focus on completing her task from birth makes her something of a child soldier, blindly working to restore and defend a system that she doesn't really know or understand. This all makes for some pretty juicy conflicts and themes to explore, but jamming that much conflict in your story is a double-edged sword, because each of these ideas has the potential to pull the story in a different direction. And despite the enormous word count of the game's script, the game still has to communicate its ideas in bite-sized chunks. It's an ambitious undertaking, to say the least, and reaching a satisfying conclusion in a reasonable amount of time would require a clear vision from the writers. Unfortunately, this is where our story starts to fall off of a cliff. Part 2. A Tale of Two Endings. This leads us to the original ending. After permanently slaying Typhon, Melinoë descends into Tartarus one last time, and while Kronos is neutralized, enters Dream to imbue Zagreus' spear in the past with the power to slay the Deathless. However, Zagreus, being Zagreus, instead proceeds to engage in banter with Kronos, and offers to let him come quietly instead of facing annihilation. Kronos scoffs at the idea, and then one transition later, we see Kronos, the harmless grandfather, playing hide-and-seek with young Melinoë, all malice apparently melted away. Another cut brings us back to the present time, where Melinoë has no idea what has happened, and heads back into the main chamber to find Kronos kneeling on the ground, submissive and repentant. We learn that nothing has changed as far as Melinoë and Hecate are concerned, but that Kronos and Zagreus remember an alternate timeline, or a mere possibility as Kronos calls it, where Kronos had a positive relationship with his grandchildren, and as such he is willing to give up his desire for conquest of all reality. After a lengthy conversation where most of the characters are very confused, everyone decides to give peace a chance and restore the House of Hades to its former state. And everyone lives happily ever after. Except alternate timeline versions of Kronos who will need to be repeatedly murdered to maintain the happy ending for this Kronos. Now, I will note the one strength of this ending before I tear it apart. It acknowledges the character of Zagreus that was established throughout the first Hades game. His whole story is about learning how to get along with old and stubborn family members, so it's totally in character for him to try and talk his way through this final conflict, if he can. I do appreciate the consistency of characterization, especially when Zagreus has the same mannerisms and is written very much to be himself. So, points for that. The problem is that Zagreus isn't the protagonist of this story. We have just gone through extraordinary effort to see the story of Melinoë, who has rewritten the laws of the world multiple times to achieve the goal she has been seeking since minute one: death to Kronos. To have the story take all agency away from her at the last minute, and let her brother from a different game, Uno, reverse the ending, could be called bold, but it's more accurately called insulting to anyone who was invested in the story this game was telling. And as I mentioned before, Supergiant themselves realized how problematic their ending was and rushed to change it just 1 month after the game's official release. The updated ending is similar, except that Melinoë and Zagreus now talk about this plan in advance and agree to try a peaceable solution before killing Kronos. And now everyone except Hecate remembers this alternate timeline where Kronos helped raise Melinoë. So some agency has been restored to our main character. I don't think the decision to change the ending was a bad one. If you can significantly improve your game with a few small changes, go for it. But I do think the necessity of this rapid change speaks to a deeper problem. This is a game that was nominated for Game of the Year, which felt it necessary to fix its own ending with rewritten and re-recorded dialogue almost immediately after release. This is frankly unheard of, and it's hard to shake the feeling that the developers were never fully committed to the ending they wrote, which in turn makes one wonder if they had fully thought it through before executing that ending in the first place. Because if we take a step back, Melinoë's loss of agency isn't the only problem with the ending. Indeed, the generally high quality of acting, along with the high quality of the game overall, helps to mask a story that is simply dropping most of its potential on the ground and abandoning it. Part 3. The Toxic Redemption Arc. Let's start with the core conceit of the ending, that if Kronos had just experienced a little more familial love, then he would give up on world conquest and become a friendly, harmless grandfather. That is a large pill to swallow. And speaking of things that are hard to swallow, Do we all remember the part of the Kronos myth where he ate his children? Possibly the most famous part of his myth? He didn't wait for them to rebel, he just heard a prophecy that his children would one day overthrow him, and decided to straight up swallow them to maintain his power. The only reason the gods survived is that Zeus was secreted away, and Kronos was tricked into swallowing a rock instead. Zeus was hidden on Crete to grow strong in exile, and later return to save his siblings and challenge his father. A setup that pretty closely matches the story of Hades 2. And I know I'm talking about mythology versus the story of the game, but Melinoë brings up this story directly to Kronos, and he does not deny eating his children. The point is that Kronos, as depicted within the game and within mythology, is a tyrant who is hell-bent on seizing and maintaining power. The idea that he could be reformed into an ally of the gods who overthrew him is perhaps not impossible, but it should take a lot more than a single flashback to a game of hide-and-seek. For comparison, let's look at Zagreus' story in the original Hades. It might seem like these two stories follow a similar trajectory, with a stubborn father intent on keeping his son locked in the underworld, only eventually swayed by the unshakable determination of Zagreus. However, the possibility of reconciliation between Hades and Zagreus is baked into the core of the story. As we come to reveal more of the plot, we learn that Hades is motivated by a desire to protect his family. He believes that by deterring Zagreus and keeping the truth to himself, that he's providing safety to those he loves. This is, of course, counterproductive and misguided, but on a basic character level, it makes sense that if Zagreus can break through his father's gruff exterior, greater understanding can be reached. Hades 2 tries to reach the same conclusion, but does nothing to set that conclusion up. Kronos is motivated by pride, power, and vengeance. Melinoë is also motivated by vengeance, and by the deep belief that if she can kill Kronos, she might earn the right to have a family. That's not much of a basis upon which to build their mutual understanding. Now, characters can grow and change, but these two characters mostly don't. They continue trying to achieve their incompatible goals until it's suddenly time for the ending. Not everyone needs a redemption arc, but that's not even my primary complaint about the ending. The issue is that the alternatives would have been much more interesting. As I mentioned before, the game seems to set up several interesting ideas and sources of tension that I was certain it was planning on exploring, and a big one was the consequence of killing time. Given Melinoë's fanatical commitment to her task, it seemed like the most natural direction for this story would be to let Melinoë succeed in destroying time, and then have to deal with the aftermath. And there are many ways to write that story beat. Perhaps both Olympus and the underworld become frozen in time, and in order to free them, you have to step into alternate possibilities with the aid of chaos, or into dreams through hypnos. Or perhaps most of the world seems fine, but there's a growing rift left where Kronos fell that will slowly grow to unravel reality. Either way, there was a rather obvious loose thread in the story to follow up on once the damage was done. For Melinoë is told early on to seek out the fates. If time itself is coming undone, who better to repair the damage than the weavers of that which will be? We're talking about characters and story beats that Supergiant already set up, and which many players fully expected to become important to the plot. Of course, we do eventually find the fates, and get resolutions to several of the secondary plot lines in the game. And they are... well, they happened. Part 4. Fate Shmate. I know this has been a bit of a tirade so far, but rest assured that it will continue to get worse from here, because we need to talk about the post-credit reveals and how they tie into the story. Foremost of these is the role of the Fates, which were found and captured by Kronos. They send Melinoë a message begging for help about halfway through the main story, and it certainly feels like they're going to be important to the plot. Instead, when you do finally reach them, they have decided that they're fine, actually, and they didn't need your help after all. Not only that, but they're going to retire and let people make their own decisions from here on. And also, at some point, eventually, the gods will need to give up their authority and hand over the world to mortals. And look, these lines are charmingly delivered, and I kind of like the character designs, but there are a few, let's generously call them issues, with this climax to the Fates plotline. For one, it is metaphysically incoherent. I'm going to really try and restrain myself from turning this part into a whole rant, but consider that the Fates claim that they are not weaving any longer. And yet, there is an inevitable predetermined outcome in the future, where a new age will dawn. So is that fated to happen, or is it more like just a hunch? We have both Prometheus and the Fates stating with certainty that some events will play out in a particular way, even though those events haven't been woven by the Fates. So what's the difference between a determined outcome that was woven and one that is just going to happen? And you can't just say that these are possibilities, because the game also makes it clear that alternate possibilities aren't deserving of the same respect as the actual world, as evidenced by runs where we ruthlessly murder alternate versions of Kronos, without any remorse. What's more, the language used by the Fates and by Homer suggests that now people and gods will be free to make their own choices, strongly implying that up until this point, no one had free will. That would include everything that happened in Hades 1, and it's a whole can of worms that we're not going to fully unpack, but suffice to say that it's pretty messy storytelling. Second problem. This resolution fundamentally misunderstands the role of mythic entities like the Fates. There is a general trend in modern retellings of mythic tales to focus on gods as people with superhuman abilities, but in their original context, it worked entirely the other way around. These beings are incarnations of various aspects of the world, first and foremost, and anthropomorphized characters, second. Consider, for instance, that the Greeks had anthropomorphized conceptions of Tartarus, the place, or for that matter, Oceanus, like the literal ocean. Conceiving of such things as being like people is a self-aware abstraction. In this context, the Fates aren't just characters. They are fate itself. We can see Melinoi, the gods, and even our narrator, Homer, all invoke the Fates to refer to more and less fortunate events. And the game even makes the whim of the Fates an actual game mechanic, used by items like the jeweled palm. So even the game itself can't accept that the Fates have retired. But most important is the third problem, that it's just a disappointing resolution. The game set up early on that you needed to find the Fates, urgently, and implied that they would be critical to the resolution of the story. But now, in the post-game, the ultimate punchline is that your quest didn't matter. They just got your attention to let you know they're fine. And yet, it gets worse, because the conversation with the Fates immediately sets up the final reveal of Hecate's story. The grand reveal is that Hecate is Melinoi, from an alternate timeline where she defeated Kronos and had consequences, namely being thrown back to the dawn of time. She spent eons awaiting her second chance at revenge, and trained her younger self to finally succeed at the task. So I will give a couple points of credit here, because this is moderately set up by details like Hecate's masked face and hidden arm, and a couple of lines of dialogue. Moreover, it's a reference to the traditional myths that Melinoi derives from, because one interpretation of them is that Melinoi is just another name for Hecate. So neat, I can appreciate that. The problem is that it makes no sense. If Hecate was sent back in time, then she must have known that Kronos was going to return and overthrow the House of Hades. So why didn't she do something about it? Her master plan is to raise Melinoë in secret for years, then have Melinoë fight her way through a small army and defeat Kronos, to then reach back in time to her brother to warn him that Kronos is regenerating. But Hecate was already there, in the past, and could have told Zagreus herself. Or for that matter, apparently she's a badass, and is already capable of defeating Kronos herself. So why didn't she just do that? Surely when Kronos appeared and took over the House of Hades, it would have been simpler to just beat him up and have the gods chop him up again, rather than fleeing with an infant version of yourself and hiding for a mortal lifetime, just to send your younger self to get revenge for you? Wouldn't she want to do it herself anyway, if she's literally been waiting since the dawn of time to get her revenge? And if you're going to write a plotline about an interesting, time-twisting consequence of defeating Kronos, why don't we get to see or experience any of that? Honestly, I would be way more on board with this reveal if they had really committed to it, and we defeat Kronos the first time, only to be sent back in time and become Hecate ourselves. The second time through, we could then search for an alternate solution to the problem of time. I'm spitballing here, but the point is that if you really want to tell a convoluted story, then include it in the story we get to be part of, instead of just telling us about it after the fact. And if you're already making a roguelike game structured around a loop, and you want to include time shenanigans, then make the most of your medium and commit to the bit. Meanwhile, there's another character whose story resolves alongside the Fates, and who epitomizes underexplored themes within Hades 2. Part 5. Cruelty of the Gods. In my last video, I claimed that Prometheus doesn't have a good motivation for fighting Melinoë, and many comments insisted that if I played through the post-credit content, that his motivations were actually well explained. So allow me to clarify further. Prometheus is most famous for gifting fire to mortal kind, stolen from Mount Olympus, a crime for which he was condemned to have his liver eaten out by a hawk while he was tied down to a rock, only for the organ to be regrown and torn from him again the next day for eternity. Or until he was freed by Heracles during his labors, depending on the story. Either way, his appearance in the story is a strong indicator that the cruelty of the Olympian gods and the progress of humankind are themes for the game to explore. And sure enough, even though Prometheus refers to Kronos as his master, and leads the army assaulting Mount Olympus, his true goal is to bring about a new age in which mortal kind will be their own masters. After your conversation with the Fates, he seems to take solace in the knowledge that his dream will come true. That's a great motivation. But here's the thing. What did fighting Melinoë have to do with it? What we discover at the end of the Three Fates questline is that the Fates apparently made up their own minds to allow a human-driven future to take shape. And if they were influenced by Prometheus, they sure don't mention it. So what would have been different if Prometheus hadn't spent all that time fighting us? And how does that lead to a pro-human future? The game doesn't actually give us any answer. Sure, we can accept that Prometheus can foretell the future, and knows what he must do to bring about the future he desires. And perhaps this is a butterfly effect situation, where the ripple effects of small decisions have large consequences. But the writers of Hades 2 just haven't actually told us the story connection here. And it sure seems like the story would have played out the same way if Prometheus wasn't there. And what's more, this prophecy from the Fates is extremely open-ended and vague. If the Fates are effectively retiring, that means they are no longer serving as a limit on the power of the gods. So it's hard to see how that's actually a good thing for humankind anytime soon. Prometheus declares it's true, but that's not exactly what I call satisfying writing. And yet this theme could very easily have been worked into the story we're actually part of. There are several plot lines that demonstrate the fickleness and cruelty of the gods, and each of them was an opportunity for Melinoë to question her assumptions and actually grow and change over time. If Prometheus really did want to make sure that the needs of mortals are accounted for, he could nudge her towards those quest lines, and withhold something Melinoi needs until he knows that she has started to take the fate of mortals seriously. Perhaps he is the one that knows the location of the fates, or perhaps he has some other MacGuffin that Melinoi needs, and he's in the way precisely because he wants to influence her, the agent of change. And this could easily be incorporated along with a story in which time gets ruptured and needs to be repaired. If Melinoi gets to learn over the course of the game that her blind desire for revenge doesn't fix the world, and then further questions the relationship between the gods and mortals that she took for granted while being raised as a child soldier, then the story gets to meaningfully grapple with its own most interesting ideas. And this is just one way for those elements to all fit together. I'm sure some of you will come up with ideas that are at least this good in the comments. The point is that it was entirely possible to write a satisfying story and accomplish everything else Supergiant set out to do with this game. What it required, however, was a clear vision of where the story was going. And I suspect that this is what was missing. I noted in my last video that it has a yes-and approach to design, starting with evocative characters and mechanics, and continuously building out from there. While this approach has served Supergiant well in most areas of development, it has made the resolution of the story feel like an afterthought or compromise. It might still feel like I'm being uncharitable or going out of my way to find plot holes, but the real problem with hand-waving, story contradictions, or undelivered potential is that these things break down trust between the writer and audience, and that can be a hard thing to get back. Once again, the real reason I find this frustrating is that I actually really like Hades 2, and in a strange way, I find it encouraging that I feel like I can have such high expectations for video game stories, because that expectation is born of seeing stories within games get more and more sophisticated over time. The goal of overthinking a story like this is to gradually gain a greater ability to appreciate, or even write, great game stories over time. And while we're here, I'm running out of time to bring up all of the details I wanted to, so I'm not going to get into all of the other NPC plotlines. But I did want to respond to a few comments I received. Firstly, I got a lot of great comments from viewers that made variations on some of the same criticisms I had, or that even outlined their own ideas for how to improve the story. And these comments were not only interesting to read, but reassured me that I wasn't insane for criticizing the story of Hades 2. When I started my prior script, I half expected to be flamed into oblivion. There were also many comments pushing back on some of the hand waves I raised. For instance, the game does actually provide an explanation for why Cerberus continues to fight you in the morning fields after the credits roll. He's just a dog playing in the mud. This is a prime example of an explanation that the game provides that nonetheless undermines their storytelling, because the initial introduction of Cerberus in the morning fields is played for maximum drama. He's not just lost, he has been overwhelmed by the spirits of sorrow, which he is likely susceptible to because he has lost his entire family. We are tasked with fighting the sadness out of Cerberus so that he can return to himself. And upon defeat, he drops a tear on the ground, a drop of elemental sorrow. So when I return to that same fight, with the same mechanics and the same visuals in the postgame, and Homer insists that Cerberus is just playing in the morning fields while being overrun by shades of pure sorrow, I just don't buy it. This is exactly what I mean by hand-waving an explanation. The writers just declare that there's an explanation when it contradicts the story that they themselves have set up. Now, that said, the larger point is valid. I'm sure that somewhere in the 400,000 words of Hades 2, there are some lines that I either missed or misremembered. Or for that matter, it's entirely possible that Supergiant will add or change lines in the future, and that some of these arguments may become moot. But that won't change the underlying purpose of this video, which is to prod at the boundaries of what it means to be an effective story within a game. Pay off what you set up, commit to your most interesting ideas, and let characters grow and change. If you have your own ideas about how the story of Hades 2 should have resolved, or you really need to tell me how wrong I am, you can let me know about it in the comments. While you're there, you might as well like, hype, and subscribe to exert your own control over the narrative and force the algorithm to recognize that this is some engaging content. Next, I am working on a script about the story of Silksong, but who knows if a game will suddenly appear and take over my brain in the meantime. Until then.